Hi and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. And today I'm flying solo, no Michelle today, but I do have two international guests, so this is a bit of an experiment for us. I've got Dr. Kirstin Mills, who does teach at Macquarie University with us, but who is currently in the UK. And I also have another special guest, which is Dr. Lorin Schwarz. He teaches literary studies and English education at York University in Toronto, Canada. So this is a very, very international podcast. So hi Kirstin, hi Lorin.
Hello.
Hi. And so we're here today to talk about something that unites the three of us across oceans, and that is Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yes.
Woohoo!
Woo! Yes, I know. I've been waiting for this opportunity. So my first question to you guys is, what is the appeal of Buffy to you? Maybe Kirstin, you can start.
The appeal of Buffy, I watched it when it first came out. I was in high school, and it really spoke to me, I think, as that target audience of the teenager, particularly a teenage girl, interested in, I don't know, like that process of discovering identity, but particularly in society, with, I don't know, girls have so much pressure on them to look a certain way, and you know, there's a stereotype of being weak or vulnerable, particularly at that age when boys start to physically overtake girls in strength and speed and things like that. And Buffy really spoke to me as a strong character that I really heavily identified with on those terms.
Yeah, I think that Kirstin and I are of a similar age, and that's certainly what drew me to the show. Lorin, how about you?
So I'm not of a similar age. I think I was much older when I started watching it. I think it was probably my first year of my PhD when I started watching it. And I think for me, it was simply the quality of the storytelling that got me into the show. He just was able to tell such a great story and use metaphor in such a way. I mean, we never knew if high school was hell or if the high school was really in hell, you know, and the characters were so well drawn out and the action was always so beautifully plotted. It took exactly a season to tell a story, and the suspense rose at just the right times. And I really think it was simply that quality that kept me watching for all those seasons.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a beautiful kind of metaphor, isn't it? That the Hellmouth is like literally underneath the high school.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, you know, when you're in high school, that feels like it's true. I remember the episode that really got me into the show was Prophecy Girl, which is the season finale of season 1. I remember, you know, liking the show before then, but all of a sudden that episode kind of turned me from a kind of casual fan into an obsessive.
I think for me, there was a similar episode when Angel loses his soul, and how many people in high school feel that their partner doesn't have a soul, and yet here we had a character who really had a partner without a soul.
I think it's such a beautiful example of like using horror or fantasy, I suppose, to kind of make literal what we all feel.
Right. That's so true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I've always been drawn to fantasy anyway. So when I heard that a show about vampires and magic and things was coming, I was so excited. So I think I was already ready, like I was primed to enjoy it. But using it in the way they do, it's so clever, I think. And I think that's what made it a cult following, as opposed to just a generic, you know, horror or vampire story.
Absolutely. So that was really well said.
Yeah, I think that was really well said too, Kirstin. And I think that calling it Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a bit of a bold move because it sounds so silly.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
But that's something the show did. The show did that so well, though, too, because they would have like the most beautiful person on the show was an evil hell god at some point. You know, they were able to kind of take your expectations and turn them right on their head so effectively.
I think that's clear from the first episode, isn't it? Because, you know, you see that the first scene in the first episode is, you know, a boy and a girl, you know, breaking into the school, and you think, okay, this is going to go badly for the girl because it looks like the stereotypical kind of setup for a horror movie. Yeah. And then the girl turns out to be the vampire.
Right.
So it's all about overturning expectations, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think Joss Whedon comments on that in one of his commentaries on that episode. I think he says that the mission statement of the show is nothing is as it seems. And that was kind of the inspiration for the whole show, was trying to turn those sort of 1980s slasher film cliches of ditzy, over-sexualized blonde girls ending up being victims in dark alleys. He wanted to, turn that on its head, and I think that's something that Buffy obviously embodies, from her name to her interest in boys and fashion and cheerleading, and, you know, her quotes like, "I may be dead, but I'm still pretty." Like,
right?
We're supposed to, like, she never kind of loses that. I mean, the series gets darker and she matures as she goes along, but I think she always enjoys her whole point in life is to have a normal life. I mean, initially it's to get through high school. It's to have a normal boyfriend. It's to, you know, pass this maths test at the weekend, which is almost more horrifying for her than the imminent apocalypse that they're dealing with.
And yet they're also facing these kind of existential crises that maybe because I was older when I watched it, I was always it wasn't just about high school to me. The characters are always wondering what's the right thing to do here, and how do I be a human being and still do this, and how do I act? You know, he really places them in this kind of existential world that they have to make the meanings for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's, I think, why Prophecy Girl was the kind of the episode that really turned me into such a fan, because she has to come to grips in that episode with the fact that she's going to die, and she has to act, but she knows that acting is going to cause her death, and yet she still acts. And I just thought, you know, such a kind of brave act, walking into what you know is going to be your kind of inevitable fate, but they don't play her. The way that Buffy's represented in that episode is not that she's like this superhuman figure who can meet her death, you know, bravely. Right. She's scared. So there's a lovely mixture there of the human and the superhero, I suppose.
The show never lost that. In all the years, the characters always stayed so human and so approachable.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the strength of characterization is certainly something that still speaks to me. I've been rewatching Buffy in preparation for this podcast. I only got up to halfway through season 3. But the characterization just strikes me as so brilliant. I mean, Cordelia. Yeah. Going back and rewatching the early episodes, Cordelia is such a beautiful character because she's supposed to be this mean girl. And yet, you know, right from the beginning, we see that that's not all that she is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I like so much about it, is that, I mean, that's part of its mission statement. Again, it plays with expectations. It usually turns them on their head. But in doing so, it shows the roundedness of all of these characters, that they have depth, they have reason. I don't think there are many or any main characters that you don't believe, you know, that that's you don't sort of understand the story and the reason behind what they're doing, unless we're not quite supposed to, like when Dawn shows up suddenly and we think, hang on, Buffy doesn't have a sister, things like that. Like, we're supposed to, it's working with our understanding of a rounded human with a backstory to play us off against that for effect.
And even those confusing moments, like when Dawn shows up, we're sharing in the confusion of the characters. So it's a way of it's a third dimension of characterization almost. Definitely.
I agree.
You know, the only character that doesn't work for me going back is Xander.
Really?
Oh, he doesn't work for you?
I love Xander. No, I loved Xander as a teenager, but he's so awful. He's so judgmental of Buffy. He's so judgmental of everybody. He's the one character who, with a bit of time and space, as a teenager, I absolutely adored him. I thought he was fantastic. But going back as an adult, I'm like, stop slut-shaming.
Yeah, right.
He just has to have the last word all the time.
Yeah.
He's very judgmental of Buffy.
He did get that way. He lectures Buffy a few times.
Yes. I don't appreciate it as an adult.
I think his Snoopy dance has worn off on you, has it? Snoopy dance is no longer working for you. Yeah.
No, it doesn't really work for me, I'm sorry. He's like the quintessential nice guy, the one that like keeps telling you how nice he is. But in fact,
he's not that nice.
He's not nice. No.
I think that's a character that kind of grew, because it seemed like at the beginning he and Willow might get together, and then he and Cordelia got together, and then I'm not sure he was part of the plan the way he went through. But by the end, I felt kind of empathetic to him, especially in the last couple of episodes. After he loses his eye, he's much more empathetic.
He does get better as he
ages. Yeah, he has to lose an eye in order to be taught a lesson.
Yeah.
I think with him, he was interesting, and I like the way they did play with his. He's pretty much the only one that doesn't actually have much power.
Right. That's right.
And he just talks a lot. But in the end, they sort of say one of his powers is that he sees everything, which is why he loses that eye, because he's always there. He observes. But I like the way that the show plays with that. Do you remember that episode where it's essentially split between Xander's story as he actually steps up and saves the day, saves the school from being burnt down by these zombies, and no one knows, no one believes him because it's Xander. What the hell could he possibly do? And they've left him out of saving the world again from yet another apocalypse because he's just right. Xander.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's the Zeppo, isn't it?
Yeah.
The episode, the Zeppo. Yeah, it always strikes me too when I think about episodes like that, how formally kind of experimental Buffy was. They did a lot of kind of different things with the form of the television show. Like we had that episode where it's sidelined. There was an apocalypse going on in the background of that episode that we don't get to see, and there was there's a big kind of Buffy Angel scene that we only kind of see because Xander runs into the room, intercepts it, and then runs out again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were playing with perception.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it strikes me as quite early in kind of the history of prestige TV, I suppose, to be doing those kinds of formal experimentation. And I mean, like things like the musical episode is another good example of that. The silent episode.
Yeah. Hush.
Yeah, I think that one, obviously that one's one of the most recognised and critically acclaimed of the episodes. And they were saying the actors routinely mention that as one that was the hardest to film, because they couldn't rely on dialogue. They found it really hard to act emotion without being able to speak it, which kind of ties into the sort of themes of that episode as well. But I love the way they played formally. It links in with the way that they just like the genre busting that Joss Whedon has also said. Genre busting is at the heart of the show. Mm-hmm. It's just so playful, isn't it? Like nothing ever stays the way you expect for very long.
Right. And we never really knew what to expect, and yet at the same time it could bring its... I'm thinking of the second last episode in the Frankenstein season with Adam, and how such a big part of it was that the friends were all having a fight. So even though there was all this other stuff going on, and it was the climax, but it wasn't the season finale, but the real crux of that was that Buffy and Willow and Xander were having a fight. In spite of the fact that there was an apocalypse about to happen, the big problem was that the three of them were not getting along. And I remember there was a scene where two of the minor characters locked themselves in the bathroom just to let them have a fight. And that just, to me, it showed such, integrity to the characterization, because all of us understood. We've all kind of stepped out of other people's story to let them go at each other when they needed to, and we were all watching to see the fight that the three of them had. Only when they got that together could they move on with the storyline and kind of stop this creature from taking over everything. So it did both of those things so well and simultaneously.
Am I remembering correctly in that scene? Is it Spike that sees through it and he sets them straight?
I think he'd been part of sowing the seeds of discord.
Yeah, he hadn't he? I'm trying to remember who it is. Someone steps up. I thought it was him.
Who was in the?
I can't remember, but I do think that he sets. I do think that there is an element to that, Kirstin, from memory, that he does kind of let them know that they had been keeping secrets from each other and hadn't been communicating. And he's the great truth teller in that particular season, isn't he? Because he's got nothing. He's got a chip in his head. He can't attack them, so he just kind of stirs things up for them. Isn't
he funny? He's that was one of my. I love that they kept bringing Spike back. From a character that was meant to just be an on the spot sort of villain. They saw that charisma and that potential in him and kept bringing him back, and he ends up being one of the key players. And I just think his character just gets better and better.
Oh, totally.
As well as dark. They explore some really dark themes through Spike because they can. But what I love about him is just he's so brazen. He just says it like it is. He doesn't, because he's evil, which we consistently forget because he's so funny and he seems so kind and loving, but he's evil, and so he says these things that are so spiteful and so petty, but that's the source of the humor. I'm thinking of particularly when Tara.
I'm thinking of the same scene. As soon as you were saying that, I thought I know exactly what she's thinking of.
Right, when she's worried she's a demon and he sees what's going on, punches her in the face, finds out that it hurts him, which is great because it means she's not a demon, because otherwise it wouldn't hurt him. So he saves the day, but by doing something awful at the same time, and then giving kudos to the bad guy for being so twisted and evil. Right. While at the same time helping out these people that he doesn't like.
The family was about to leave her for it, and all of the good guys stood up for them and said, you'll have to go through me, you'll have to go through me. And Spike says, you don't have to go through me, I don't really care what happened. Yeah. So he did the right thing.
Delightfully immoral.
Yeah.
But you know what scene I love of Spike, and it's in that episode in which he recounts to Buffy how he's killed the two previous Slayers. It's in that episode.
Yes.
Fool for Love, and he at the end Buffy finds out that her mother is quite sick, and she's sitting on the stairs crying, and he's got a gun and he's about to kill her. And he sees her crying, and he sits down and awkwardly kind of pats her on the shoulder, and it's such a beautiful scene. Like, oh, will I kill her? No, I'll kind of pat her on the shoulder and sit here and let her cry. I mean, he's such a great character.
He's so conflicted, isn't he? I think he's such a lovely character for exploring that conflict, like that he's got raging inside him. In fact, I found that because he doesn't have a soul, that's why he was so compelling, because he acted like he did. Right. He acted like he really cared, and he did love. He loved Buffy, but he was also driven by this desire to kill her.
There's that line in the...
what made him more interesting than Angel. I was just going to say, I think that's what made him more interesting than Angel, because Angel, there was good Angel, and then there was Angelus, who was bad Angel, evil Angel, and there was no kind of space in between. At least on Buffy, they complicate things on Angel a bit more, but on Buffy there was good and bad, and it was kind of very straightforward who he was at any one time. Whereas with Spike, there was this huge continuum of his behavior. He could be completely amoral, he could be completely evil, and yet he could also be capable of great acts of kindness and love and generosity. So there was, even though he didn't have a soul, so he was just a much more kind of complex character, which explains why I always shipped Buffy Spike, not Buffy Angel.
Yeah. I've
Sorry,
changed.
Lorin, I interrupted you.
Oh, really?
Sorry, you've changed.
I've changed in my opinions. I go back and forth, and I think it reflects my different stages of life. Like at one point, I think everyone initially watching gets to season 4 and dislikes Riley as a potential love interest.
Because, Riley is terrible.
Really? Yeah, because he just seems boring in comparison to Angel.
I see, yeah.
But then I went through a stage where I thought, no, Buffy, he's the healthy option. Go with the steady guy.
Right.
But of course, then you eventually go back and you're like, no, you need a bit more excitement in life. Angel's fine, Spike's fine, pick a vampire, whatever.
But Spike was also too much excitement sometimes. There was that horrible scene I'm remembering in the bathroom where he almost rapes her. That's more excitement than the average Slayer wants, I think.
Well, definitely, and I think that they're bringing that back because he's evil. Like, I think they're reminding us there, don't get so complacent. We're not retelling another Angel story. This guy doesn't have a soul.
I actually think that scene was a bit of a kind of reminder to the audience as much as anything else. So I think you're spot on there, Kirstin, because I think that, and I was guilty of this as a teenage viewer, of romanticising Buffy Spike, because I thought, he's reforming out of, his love for her, and he doesn't have a soul, but he's changing his behaviour, and that was a real kind of, reminder, no, this is actually a man with no soul.
But I think it's even more complicated than that. It's a demon, but that's a mistake that a lot of human guys make too, right? There's so much talk about no means no. In Canada, we talk about no means no, and consent is very important. So even that was a little bit ambiguous. Was it because he was some kind of a monster without a soul, or was he just really in love with her and completely consumed by his own desire? I'm not exactly sure what caused that to happen.
Yeah,
I think
that's such a great point.
yeah, I think it's dealing with all of that. Obviously, like you can see in his face, he's driven by that sort of demonic impulse to, attack in whatever way that happens to be. But he's also he's confusing that sort of impulse
Right.
with passion and with love, which
And with love.
yeah, and it's just and love as ownership and love as control
Right.
and as a consuming force, which is really dangerous territory, and particularly in teenagers moving into adulthood, experiencing young adulthood and more relationships and things like that. It's really familiar territory for a lot of viewers, I think.
Absolutely. I wish that only happened to people without a soul, because then we'd never have that kind of violence against women.
Yeah.
But it's a very real problem, and I think it did a very beautiful job of showing how frightening and how terrible that line is when it's crossed.
Definitely, particularly with so much, this whole culture of victim blaming, particularly online these days, to have someone like Buffy, someone so normally powerful, to have her power stripped away, and it just showed how truly vulnerable she was in that situation. And I think it makes us realize even more the impossibility in those situations of fighting back, of doing what people say you should do when they're sitting in their armchairs discussing how you should have gotten out of that situation yourself.
Right. Yeah. And she got hurt too. She got pretty significant. If I'm
Yeah.
remembering the scene correctly, she wasn't a Slayer anymore. I think she banged herself on the tub as she was trying to get away from him, and she was really injured from it.
Definitely. It was really close call.
It was. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it continues that theme of like the supernatural being used as a way to explore like real human problems, as it always has been used on Buffy. His kind of demonness is not really as important as the fact that, yes, as Lorin rightly points out, he's a man who has a problem with consent, and who has not actually doesn't have consent for what he has done.
Right.
And that's such a human problem.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I like how you.
I was
Go ahead.
wondering if you might. Sorry, I was going to just ask if you might comment on the feminism of the show.
Well, sorry, just a pause while we wait for each other to speak. I think, again, returning to things Joss Whedon has actually said, he didn't initially set out to do that. He also wanted to create a popular TV show. But at the same time, whether he meant to or not, wrapped up in that initial idea of turning those cliches on their head is a feminist statement. And then I think he realised what he was working with, and it became really important by the end of the show. I think to modern viewers, like contemporary viewers now looking back, it can be difficult for some people to see women presented as beautiful, conventionally attractive, dressed in, fashionable clothing that sexualizes them somehow. And it can be really confronting to think of that as being feminist, because there's this tendency to think that if it's going to be feminist, it has to be anti-sexual. The women aren't allowed to look like that. But I think we've got to remember the context that this is in, and also it's about teenagers. It's about teenagers who are in that context. And if Buffy needs to embrace those certain stereotypes in order to turn them on their heads.
Right. Really well put.
Yeah, I just thank you. I don't know. I think it's for me that's sort of where the feminism starts. It's in turning those simple stereotypes on their heads. But then we get that evolution throughout the series as Buffy grows, as her power grows, as her understanding of the whole system grows. She also outgrows the initial patriarchal sort of system that sets her up, as in this all-white English male Watchers Council that dictates, the Slayers and things. We actually get this sort of sense of the history way back into like thousands of years ago when the first Slayer was created. We get that backstory, and we really understand what Buffy's now has been rebelling against the whole time, but she now understands it as an actual system where men control women, as opposed to just her being a rebellious teenager acting out against her watcher. And so by the end, when I think, sorry to keep rambling on about this, but when they reach the end of the series and they have Willow take that power from all the potential and give that power to the potential slayers, what they're doing there is returning the power to the women. The Watchers mean nothing by that point. It's about not only just one powerful woman, it's about all powerful women.
Do you remember in the last episode, though, everything, I agree with everything you said. You brought some things to mind. So the last episode, Nathan, the first evil, has become this priest. And there was a shot, I watched that one to prepare for the podcast, and there was kind of a moment where he calls her a bitch. Remember? And that was so shocking to me, and it kind of brought me back to the fact that this really is a very feminist kind of text, because here we have a priest who's like, he's this strong man, and he's using this horrible word to call this young girl who we care about. And it's a very kind of masculine dominated, and she of course has to take care. He's the first evil, so she takes care of that. But I also think the show, that's what I thought of when you were talking so beautifully a minute ago. But I also thought of how it's kind of feminism in the right first generation of it's a very inclusive show. It's not just feminism for women, it's for everybody who's on the outside and everybody who's abject to the dominant narrative. It's very sympathetic to gay people even before it was fashionable for that to happen. We've got main characters who are queer, and they were kind of being themselves, and it was fine. And other kinds of people who are left on the margins and left outside. I think it's a very kind of approachable feminism for everybody.
I completely agree. And like in that last scene when they evoke the power of the Slayers,
right? The
fact that everyone is involved in that, you've got like even Spike has a crucial role to play there. And Willow is not a Slayer, but she's channeling the power, and you see her sort of make that choice to, because magic has consumed her before that point. It's evil. She won't touch it. Coco. Sorry, my dog is just...
Mine's active too, don't worry.
Stop it. She's gets excited when I talk about Slayers.
Oh, of course, I understand.
But yeah, I think in that final scene, everyone has their part to play, and that's the last season is very much about awakening everyone's important, like everyone is a piece of the puzzle, everyone has their role to play and their significance in the world, if only you could just find it and work together to sort of achieve goals, I guess, whatever they may be.
Nobody's left out, which I think that idea that nobody is left out, or nobody's on the margin, or nobody doesn't have that part to play or that story to tell, I think that's feminism at its best in a way.
Definitely.
I just wanted to pick up too on what Lorin was saying about Willow and Tara, because I think it's easy to kind of forget how significant that was.
That's
the
right.
portrayal of a lesbian relationship on television. That was the first lesbian kiss that had ever been aired on American network television.
Was it?
And
I didn't know that either.
It was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, I read that recently, and just showing a healthy kind of functional queer relationship was a huge breakthrough for television at the time, which actually leads me to think about the controversy that happened when Tara's killed off, because
that was horrible.
A lot of viewers were really upset about that, because this had been a kind of really positive representation of a gay relationship, and then one of the characters is killed off, and so that caused a lot of disquiet in the Buffy kind of fandom community.
Yeah, but I think like no relationships really survive by the end, and I think the fact that moment needed to be utterly soul-destroying for Willow's story. It was really about Willow's arc there. They needed a catalyst for her to go fully dark and turn murderous, and nothing but destroying what had been so beautiful and pure and light-filled before that. I mean, most of the scenes, I think, prior to that point, with Willow and Tara, they're filmed in the sunlight, and they've got these beautiful frolicking dresses on, and they're out in the grass, and it's really pretty. And I think that's meant to sort of build us up. Wow, this is such a pure, gorgeous thing. And then that happens. And I think it's that impact. So if anything, it's not your conventional... They took what they had been representing as the most positive, beautiful relationship, and that's the only one they could have really done it to, I think. So perhaps
it's part of what the show did. But the
Yeah.
show was so ruthless. I mean, if the plot called on a character to die, the character died. It didn't matter how beloved the character was or how much the fans would have complained. I mean, Joss Whedon really wasn't afraid to break all of our hearts to make his point stronger. And I think that's why that point was so powerful and why it made such an important kind of impact towards not only the feminism and inclusion and everybody watching that story in particular, but for the show itself.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it didn't pull punches at all because I mean, Joss Whedon kills off Buffy at the end of season 5, and I mean, you knew watching it that she would be back eventually because the show is still going to be Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but he does kill her off, and he does represent a world in which Buffy is dead, and we know that she's going to come back, and we know that that's going to be a kind of issue, but he doesn't pull any punches. He lets the worst thing happen because in life, we don't have kind of nice, neat endings.
Yeah,
right.
and I think the series does that more and more as the series goes on. The villains become less supernatural in a way. Like we get Andrew and what's his name?
Yeah.
Jonathan and Andrew as
Jonathan
these
and
very
Lorin.
human villains, and that scene when Tara is killed, that's not supernatural. That's a very real, ugly, irreversible death.
It was with a
and
gun.
it's the same-
She was shot.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in America, it's such a real, like, source of anguish and death. And I think the same thing with Joyce's death, Buffy's mum.
Oh, that was horrible.
That episode, The Body, yeah, it was about. It's so inconceivable in a show where they're constantly dealing with things that come back from the dead. To have someone die of something as mundane as an aneurysm, and to have that realization that whole episode is about, of that first day when you realize they're not coming back, that this is real, And I think
It was very powerful.
yeah, and I think the series does that as it goes on. It stops being sort of so symbolic, and it starts dealing with death as a real thing, a real hard-hitting, impacting thing that happens to them, and then they just have to deal with and move on. And I think, yeah, Tara's is one of the most important of those.
I wanted to go back to that idea about the nerd characters, I suppose, because that's another example, as you say, Kirstin, that the show does become kind of less supernatural as it goes along. And what's interesting about those characters is that where their villainy lies is the fact that they've created these kind of female sex slave robot things.
Yeah.
And that they're using women as kind of as sexual servants because they feel like they haven't, because they're nerds, they haven't been very successful with women. So it's run of the mill kind of misogyny that actually is at the heart of what's going on in that season.
I think the show never loses that, though, too. There's always a little bit of showing how misogyny, when it's left to run amok, can really be damaging to human life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think they just sort of fit in with the kind of villains that underestimate Buffy or denigrate her because she's female. Leading back to what Lorin was saying earlier about the preacher at the final season, which is, he's just one of the most horribly misogynistic,
Horrible.
ultra conservative sort of, yeah, they've got the religious connotations and everything. Just so much going on there, and I think these guys just kind of fit into that pattern a little bit, but they also do it in a way that shows the appeal, I think, because Jonathan in school was shown to be quite a nice, sensitive sort of person. Like, we get to know him a little bit, and then suddenly he emerges later as this super villain, and it's almost like their grab for power meant achieving a position via misogyny. And that's quite a common thing. I think that sort of lad culture,
Right.
where you bond with other men by denigrating women.
But even they're a little bit more complex, because if I didn't watch too much of that, but I think there's a homoerotic element happening. There's 3 of them at first, And one of the minor nerds is kind of like, there's a suggestion that he might kind of have some feelings that are not just kind of like, I want to be your he wants to be more than friends with the one that shot Tara. I can't remember his name, but
Warren,
yeah. So he
yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I think was it not Jonathan, the other one,
Andrew.
Andrew. He kind of
yeah.
Andrew seems to really like him very much, and so there's the lad culture and there's misogyny and there's a buddy issue there, but there's also more than that. They're more complex, and in the end, they're not the villain of that season. That season ends with like Willow being the super villain too.
Yeah.
And that leads us to that brilliant episode in which Andrew kind of narrates the show and as a masterpiece theatre.
That was wonderful.
Talking about the vampires. Yeah, I mean, it's so brilliant because, it takes something so serious as this, misogynist lad culture that we've been talking about, and then transitions him into this kind of pathetic character who's, isolated, but he's also very funny. I thought it was just the way that they could kind of transition characters was just brilliant.
Really good. Was this the episode where he's filming? He's making a little documentary?
Yes.
Yeah, that was amazing because we sort of open through his lens, really, and we sort of it's like the actual reality of what we're seeing. Buffy's sort of slow-mo running with her hair flicking, and then it zips back to real life, and she goes, "Turn that camera off," and gets annoyed with him. And that's one of the things, I don't know if you feel the same, but I felt in that season we saw a lot of Buffy monologuing, a lot of speeches that sounded the same, and I think the writers were catching on to the fact that there was probably a little too much of that going on. So in that scene, they respond to their fans. I think they say, "Yeah, we see you, we hear you." So Andrew, there's a bit where Buffy's doing a classic speech, and he starts filming her, and then he pans back to him and he says, "Buffy tends to talk for a while. Let's go and look at something else for a bit." And he keeps panning back and going, "Nope, she's still going." And then, I like the way, I think that's one of the hallmarks of the show as well. Just the way it jokes with its audience. Yeah. The jokes never seem at our expense or even necessarily at the characters' expense, because the characters are making the jokes themselves. It's a very self-aware show.
Well, that's visible in the musical episode, isn't it? Because there's that line about Dawn's in trouble, it must be Tuesday, because the show aired on a Tuesday. Yeah. So it's very and it's playing on the fact that how many episodes that particular season were predicated on Dawn being in trouble. We have to go save her.
The line I remember of self-awareness is Buffy's explaining the Hellmouth to someone, and she said something like, "Oh, it tends to blow in October and April, and those are sweeps weeks in America when they kind of ramp up the drama on television because that's when they're watching to see who's watching what." So I thought the show knows that we're watching it and it's loving us back somehow.
Yeah.
I have to tell you about my brief moment of fandom in Buffy fandom, by the way.
Please.
I was a super fan, and I caused a bit of a crisis online because I went to a Buffy convention and I met the actor who played Xander. And this was before the end of season 6 aired, and I said to him, "What's happening with Spike?" because I was obsessed with Spike. And he said to me, "Well, Spike's getting an extension." And so, being the good little girl that I was, I went and reported that to my favourite Buffy fandom site online. I think it was like a Yahoo group. This was like the late 90s.
Oh, no.
And it became this huge thing, like, what is his extension? And what does that mean? And who is this Steph from Sydney? And I became Stephen halfway
That was
through.
you?
That was me. Yeah. And it turned out that they were referring, the extension was Spike's soul, which he gets at the end of season 6, beginning of season 7. But I did cause a controversy in Buffy fandom, and that no matter what I ever achieve in my life, that will be my proudest moment.
What was the convention like?
What was the convention like? I don't remember much of it, to be honest. I remember being very, very obsessed with Buffy. I don't remember much of the convention except that there were a lot of people. A lot of people. And I was really surprised because I tended to talk to people about Buffy online and not in real life. And so I was amazed that there were people in real life who watched the show.
And it's not. I was always a little bit nervous to tell people that I was so faithful to the show as much as I was, because people are like, you're watching that? Are you? It still maintained a kind of the vampire is always this kind of subculture thing that, the cool kids. It's kind of a reflection of Buffy. The cool kids aren't watching Buffy, and yet everybody was.
Yeah, it was very much, that's sort of almost the definition initially. I think it's changed a bit with Netflix and things like that, but initially that's kind of what cult things were, weren't they? They were a bit underground, a little bit hush-hush, and you didn't quite know how many other people out there were enjoying it, but you find out years later that it was extremely dedicated, and so I think that's one of the things that I found so, heartening as well as interesting, is that 20 years later I still enjoy it just as much as I did back then, if not more. I think on rewatching, you pick up so much more, and I think it's
one of those special shows. Yeah, a lot of shows, when I come back to them 15 years later and I look, they're not. I think, why did I watch that so much? But Buffy is just as good as it was the first time.
Yeah, I think you get more out of it too. That the more, like, as your life changes and we mature. Going back to the first time I was watching it, I was 13 or 14 or whatever, and now looking, you get different things out of it because you reflect on it from a different perspective and it relates to you in a different way.
Right, that's right.
And I'm certainly always surprised. Like, I have taught Buffy, which has been one of the most exciting things I've ever done, and
wow.
I'm surprised by how much my students actually are into it, because they weren't even alive, I think, or they were being born when the show was airing, and yet they seem to come to me with some kind of knowledge of the show.
Wow.
And they're aware of the show, and they're really into the show. And even those who are watching it for the first time because I made them, they often will send me, like really hysterical emails saying, "Oh my God, I had to go watch all 144 episodes or whatever there are of the show because I loved it so much, even though I was only supposed to watch 3." So it's something that sort of continues. Even though it's on one level kind of very much of the 90s in its kind of girl power kind of ethos, it's also speaks across, I think, in a nice way. And certainly I've been rewatching the show for this podcast, as well as because I really just wanted an excuse to rewatch it. And as you say, Kirstin, you get so many different things out of it as an adult, coming back to it and watching it. I'm loving it just as much as I did when I was a teenager. I feel the need to go online and find like a new Buffy site. I don't know what the sites are these days or how to find them. I'm too old for that now, but I feel like I need to talk about it.
You're going to finish the season, aren't you? We've done the podcast now, but you're still going to finish it.
I'm going to finish the whole 7 series. We're quickly running out of time, but I wanted to ask you guys before we go, favourite episode or episode that stands out for you?
Oh, don't do this to me.
That's a hard
I think I've been thinking about
question.
it. No, I was thinking about it today because I had a feeling you were going to ask that question. I think the most there's so many powerful episodes, and so many episodes do different things, but I think I'll go back to what you were saying before. The episode that really turned me into a Buffy fan, I think, was Becoming Part 1. And where Angel had lost his soul, and Jennifer Callender had died that season. She was an English teacher or something, and I wanted to be an English teacher so much, so I was into that. I think I was an English teacher by the time she died, actually. But Buffy has to make that horrible choice. It's that one moment where Angel gets his soul back, and she sees that he has his soul back, but she has to kill him to stop hell on earth from coming into being, and so she just makes the horrible choice. And that episode was so well done and so beautifully put together that was the episode for me that kind of made me the Buffy fan. So that's the answer I'll deposit, even though there's so many episodes I loved.
Have you thought about it, Kirstin?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person that just I don't have favorites, really. It's really hard for me to choose. I'd say in general I tend to go with the earlier episodes. I think they have more of that classic formula. They're a bit more simple in some ways. There's a lot more humor, I find. Yeah.
People don't like it so much. The critics are like, just ignore season 1 and start with season 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
See, season 1 was just
so had some great moments.
So enjoyably simple in its premise.
I thought so too.
That's when we started out with it, and the ending of that first episode is I think my favorite when the teenagers are having, stop the vampires, save the world again, they're suddenly just talking about all the ways they're going to fail high school. And it just turns around and Giles says, the Earth is doomed. And I think that's how it finishes that episode. We haven't spoken about Giles much, but I think he's got to be one of my favourite characters. So I think the earlier episodes for me, with that classic dynamic of the main Scooby Gang and Giles, and really those classic early monsters, I think they're my favourites.
Well, to talk about Giles for a second, going back and rewatching it, I'm all about Giles now.
Yes.
Because we're older and we're the teachers now.
We're the teachers now, and everything that Giles, I relate to him. I think he's wonderful. He's one of my favourite characters.
Yeah.
He's not old at all. When they make fun of him for being old, I'm very offended.
There's reasons for that, but I'm not going to say them.
Yeah.
I know. I understand the reasons.
I love that he embodies that, though, with the tweed and the English culture and the cups of tea. But then when he gets to Ripper, when he returns to that character, oh my god, that was such a good side to explore to Giles. Again, that's them turning what we see on its head and subverting our expectations.
And he saves the day. He kills Glory. Well, he kills Ben, who is Glory.
That was a tough moment, though. That was a very hard moment to watch because Buffy walked away and was the hero, and Giles had to kind of pick up the pieces and do the right thing that was horrible to watch. That was an important moment, I think.
But he was so much the protector and the father figure that he did what she couldn't do, which was murder.
That's right.
I'm going to make a claim, actually, for that episode being my favourite.
I love that episode,
the last
too.
Episode of season 5. I love it. That's the season where Buffy sacrifices herself for Dawn, and everything about that episode is brilliant. I remember absolutely sobbing my little heart out when I saw it, and I understood on an intellectual level that Buffy would be back, but it didn't feel like it. I thought it was just a brilliant episode, and the way that they tied all of the kind of threads of that season, kind of narratively, into that final episode, I thought was brilliant. It was just a great masterclass in plotting, because everything came back.
It was fantastic.
Around and was wrapped up.
There was that wonderful line that Buffy says to Dawn too that I'm quite haunted by, where she says something like, "The hardest part of being in the world is to live in it." And that's one of the things you might have been saying, Steph. Where the older I get, the more I see how true that is.
Me too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that kind of encompassed. It felt like the show became quite manic depressive towards the end. Like it was like really funny and really sad at the same time. But it kind of, for me initially, I kind of stopped watching for a while because I don't think I was quite at the same space anymore. But then, I don't know what it is. Maybe as I've gotten older, I've gone, you know what? Yeah, it is really hard. Like life is
that's
hard.
Right.
Life is super depressing. I'll watch Buffy.
It's true. Life is funny and hard.
Yeah, and it's a show that can do both. All right, I think that's all we've got time for today, guys. Thank you for staying up late or being up early, or I don't even know what time it is in any place, including here anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorin.
This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed it too, and thank you, Kirstin, once again, rejoining us after your wonderful Harry Potter session.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me again. It's been really lovely.
I think you're our first repeat guest, so we'll probably see you again.
Good. I hope so.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was truly a pleasure talking about Buffy with you.
Thank you.
So this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. Michelle, we missed you. Please come back to us soon. And for all of our listeners out there, it would be wonderful if you could rate and review us on iTunes. It really helps people to find the show. And also, it'd be great if you could provide any feedback or suggestions for future episodes. So this is Stephanie, and this is Macquarie University and From the Lighthouse signing off for 2 weeks. See you. Bye.